Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Another great guest is on tap for you today, and for such episodes, I always add a disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against a guest's political views or groups they support, but our topics are always something that people across the political spectrum can get something out of. Our civic culture is in a precarious state, and there isn't nearly enough healthy engagement with it. Some people are too scared or apathetic to engage with it meaningfully. Some people want to engage with it, but find it too difficult to do so. Some people engage with it in far too hostile and toxic a manner. And it's now more critical than ever to renew the civic health of America. But that's far easier said than done. So how do we revitalize our civics and get back to more healthily engaging with our political system? Well, my guest today, Daniel Yudkin, may have one of those solutions, a new civic vision called Potentialism. Daniel is the director of the Beacon Project, a multi-year initiative to identify a new civic vision for America's exhausted majority. The Beacon Project itself is part of the nonpartisan organization More in Common, a nonprofit seeking to understand and address social division. And Daniel is also a visiting scholar with the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And previously, he was a postdoctoral researcher at Yale and earned a PhD in social psychology from New York University. Now, let's talk to Daniel and get his insights into what potentialism is and how it could lead to an American civic renewal. Please welcome Daniel Yudkin to the show. Daniel, thanks for coming on. How are you?
I'm good, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Hey, absolutely. Really appreciate you being on here. So I always like to go back in time with my guests to their why for what they do and their relation to the episode's topic. So why did you initially become involved in efforts toward civic renewal and political bridge building?
My background is in social psychology. I've been studying and interested in human behavior for many years, most of my life, in fact. Always really interested in sort of what makes people tick, why they do what they do, why they believe what they believe. And so I spent many years in graduate school studying human behavior, human psychology, and how people make decisions. And I got interested in morality during that time. So one particularly interesting area where people disagree in the way that they understand the world is in their moral decisions, their judgments about right and wrong, good and bad. And so it was through that I started to become really interested in, through that lens of morality. Obviously, like our political space is one of the places where moral disagreements get amplified, where they become extremely consequential, and where they have an enormous impact on the trajectory of our country and the way that we live our lives. And so it was through this journey of, number one, studying and interested in people, but then trying to dig below the surface and understand kind of how and what makes people disagree about these everyday moral topics, and then what implications those disagreements have for our society and our political sphere. That's how I kind of got interested in this type of stuff.
Yeah, that is such a critical aspect, right? We all have our own sets of morals, things that we believe in, our, basic set of values. And obviously those are important to have, but of course, we also see a lot of people go too far with it, with their moralized attitudes, and so far where they think if they even budge from their point of view that they're being immoral. And obviously that's one of the really key things to try to address there. But I think that's a very noble pursuit, and I can really appreciate and relate to that. But before we get to potentialism, I want to touch a little bit more on the Beacon Project overall. So why was the Beacon Project founded, and how did you get involved in it? And was potentialism part of it from the get-go?
Yeah, the Beacon Project. So I guess the context here is More in Common. So this is the organization that's been around for about 10 years. And our mission as an organization is to leverage insights from social psychology to better understand and bridge social division. And so we put out a couple reports in 2017, 2018, 2019. One was called Hidden Tribes, which is an examination of the different of the political landscape that suggests that it's not just about us and them. It's not about red versus blue, liberal versus conservative, but actually there's 7 different tribes in the American population that hold differing core beliefs, core values, motivations, and ways of seeing the world. And so This is the kind of our intellectual history. And also part of that is identifying this group that we call the exhausted majority. This makes up about 2/3 of the American population. This is a group that doesn't really subscribe to the beliefs on either of the political extremes, but actually is much more interested in finding common ground and having more nuanced views. But they're also not as active in the political conversation because they're just not as likely to post on social media and to be involved in sort of everyday political disagreements. And so, building on this research, our work at More in Common has continued to try to kind of figure out how to better understand our political landscape and how to use those insights to help us get a little bit more united and work through our divisions. What the Beacon Project is an effort to move past the kind of the diagnosis and trying to figure out what's going on now and offer some ideas or invitations or recommendations about where we ought to go from here, where we could go from here. And so what we're trying to do is, instead of just saying, here's what's wrong, we're trying to say, here's a direction that we could go. Here's a vision for the future that could help us move outside of the current kind of very binary dynamic that we're in, the left versus right dynamic that we're in our political sphere, and really kind of offer a new way of understanding what it means to be an American, what it means to be a person, what it means to be a citizen at this particular moment in time.
That's fascinating. So more in common is probably oversimplified, but more in common is probably more of the here's the research that shows how we're divided, but the Beacon Project's more about the practical how do we actually solve that division then.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit more. There's a bit of both on both sides. Of course, at More in
Right.
Common, we are focused on some solutions as well. And the Beacon Project is also involved in quite a lot of research. So we are also trying to kind of like do some survey work and do focus groups, have conversations, interviews with Americans to try to figure out how they're feeling and what we can do to address their basic concerns. But yes, the Beacon Project is really focused on kind of also just not the here and now, kind of like the 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, the longer time horizon. What kinds of changes do we need to make in our society? And how can we reimagine what it means to what our obligations are to each other? What are our rights and responsibilities as people in this moment? And how can we reimagine the answers to those questions in a way that kind of moves past the divisions that we're are so entrenched in right now?
And unfortunately, that's something I don't think we focus on enough. Not even in the greater depolarization space. Sometimes we don't focus enough on the what is our responsibilities to each other. I mean, yes, it obviously talking about how to come together more and to find more common ground, but then beyond this kind of goes a little bit further than that, I think, than sometimes the depolarization movement goes. So I can really appreciate that. A couple of the things that really stood out to me from earlier in that answer was, the seven tribes. I thought that was a really interesting division. I've seen different studies. I've kind of tried to do something similar. I remember back in, I want to say it was like 2016, probably right around the 2016 election when Pew Research Center had something similar where they broke down the Republican and Democratic parties into four factions, for lack of a better term. So
Yeah.
I always find that kind of thing fascinating. And then, of course, when you bring up how there's a huge portion of people who are part of this exhausted majority, but a lot of times they're not as active in politics. And that's what makes these polarized voices seem amplified and seem so much more numerous than they actually are. But for the crux of this discussion on the Beacon Project's website, potentialism is, to quote the website, it's grounded in a single maxim: everyone has something to offer, a gift, and the right and responsibility to develop that gift and share it with others. So, in your own words, can you expound further on what that means, including why it is both a right and a responsibility?
Yeah. So to kind of back up a little bit, one thing that we noticed in our research at More in Common is a core tension in how people think about and navigate topics around rights and responsibilities. On one side, you have this is kind of broad brushstrokes, but typically what we among people on the left, there's a real emphasis on sort of like what are the minimum conditions for justice that could allow people to thrive? What are our rights? What do we deserve from the state in order to be able to live flourishing lives. On the right, you have a lot of discourse around personal responsibility. You got to lift yourself up by your bootstraps and make the most of your life. And the reality is that most Americans don't see things in those kinds of black and white terms. They think of ourselves as needing minimum conditions that we need to be able to thrive, and that we should have a functional and responsive and efficient government that allows people these kind of minimum conditions. But there's also a degree to which individuals and people have an obligation both to themselves and to the people around them to make the most of those opportunities, and to kind of like pursue their own goals, and to reflect on what it is they can do to both contribute in a local sense and then also contribute to the civic community that we have as Americans. And so this fundamental insight that we arrived at kind of through our research at More in Common leads to the idea that if you're trying to craft a narrative that that can transcend our current divisions, what you want to be looking for is a way of blending these competing impulses that is not just sort of like, oh, let's meet in the middle, it's just like centrism, but offers a coherent vision and a clear understanding of what are the limits and what is the extent of those rights and responsibilities. So that was the kind of task we set ourselves when it came to developing this framework that we're calling potentialism. Now, what potentialism does is it starts starts with a kind of a basic assumption or observation about human nature, and what that is that everybody has something, everyone has something to offer, everyone has something to contribute, and so the question then is, if we assume that everyone has something to contribute, what kind of a society do we want to try to build? And the first thing you might say is, well, what you want is a society in which everybody has the opportunity to contribute, to develop themselves, and to develop that contribution. But that's not the whole story, because if we have something of value that other people that can improve other people's lives, we don't just have a right to share that gift, we also have a responsibility to do so. And so this is the very simple idea at the core of potentialism, which is everybody has a gift. And what we want is a society in which everyone has the opportunity, a right to develop that gift, but we also recognize we have a culture of responsibility where we all individually recognize that part of our obligations as members of this society is to cultivate ourselves in such a way as to be able to share that gift and develop it and improve others' lives in the process. So this is the kind of the central like the crux of this framework, and the kind of the invitation, or the question that we're exploring with this is, what would it look like to take this fairly simple idea, this fairly simple framework that everyone has something to contribute, and what would it look like to instantiate that as a genuine political philosophy, as something that actually grounds our understanding of what the basic social contract is in America. And that's the question. How does it differ from other philosophies? Does it differ from liberalism, from conservatism? What does it look like to start with this core maxim of everyone has a right and responsibility to develop and share their gifts? So that's the kind of the initial impetus behind this work.
Something you said towards the beginning of the answer, I can really appreciate, and something I think needs to be advertised, for lack of a better term, more often, is, to paraphrase what you said, it's not centrism for its own sake, because just because you're center of the road, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're in the right either. Just doing it because it's centrism, you're still taking a position, and that's still going to make people not want to come and understand what other people have to say. But I think that's such an important part to say, how there's a right and a responsibility. When you take rights, which is more of a left concern, and responsibility is more of a right concern, and blend those two together, there is a reasonable blending of those two, like you mentioned. And also, one of my big things is, the lack of political efficacy that we see today. And so I really would love to see how potentialism can really help improve that? Because it's, somebody might hear potentialism, and of course we'll get more into this question a little bit later on, but somebody might look at and say potentialism, oh, that sounds like a little too flowery and philosophical. But no, you are talking about a very practical way of how do we get these gifts out of people, and how do they each of them use this gift. And if you can successfully convince people, hey, you all have a gift for how you can help positively impact civics in this country, that is inherently going to improve efficacy as well. So I'm really intrigued to see how potentialism can really improve that.
Yeah. Yeah, it is an interesting, just to respond to this idea, right? The idea of a gift. And I think people are inherently there's an inherent suspicion at the idea that, because, in the past the idea of a gift has been used to argue, oh, everyone's gifted and everyone's special and everyone's a unique flower, right? And of course, to conservative ears, they hear that and they often will sort of associate it with some of the excesses of liberal education, in which everybody's a winner, everyone gets a gold star and a trophy, that sort of thing. There's some cliches and stereotypes around that as a liberal, in terms of liberal education. But and so it is important, but let's take it literally for a second, right? Like the idea that everybody has something to contribute, right? What would it mean to say the opposite of that? That's to say that some people have nothing to offer. Some people have absolutely nothing to offer society. And to me, the idea that when we form the nature of the social contract, a social contract is an agreement we make with each other, right? And it's an agreement for mutual benefit. And the implication when we're signing a social contract with each other is that there's some sort of mutual advantage that emerges from the fact that we are making an agreement with each other to live together in a society. And so inherent in the idea of signing a contract is the inherent agency and value of the person that you are engaged in that contract with. And so to me, there's something actually fundamental about the assumption that everybody has something to offer. Now, does that mean that everyone's going to be the next LeBron James or everyone's going to be the next Elon Musk, the next billionaire? No, doesn't mean that. What it means is that we start from the assumption that there is something of value that everyone has to contribute to society. And we proceed with that as a founding assumption, and then we ask what it means to structure our society with that as the basic premise. And these gifts can be small or large. You can there's an enormous amount of value that comes from being a caregiver or a teacher um, or a parent or people who are serving vital roles in our society, without which our society wouldn't be able to function. Those are gifts too. And so part of what potentialism also tries to do is to uh, reassert respect and dignity for the different ways that people have for contributing, and to kind of remove our current focus on things like influence and how many followers do you have and how much wealth and power do you have, and to get back to a place where we assert the fundamental dignity of every person, and as a function of that dignity, their right and obligation to contribute. And so to that extent, just to go back to this point, I do agree that like there is an inherent suspicion with the notion of everyone having a gift. But actually, if you think about it and we take it literally and we get rid of some of the stuff, the baggage that it's been associated with, I think that almost everyone would agree that it is true.
I think that's a really great clarification to make there, and I would certainly agree with that. Because there is that, when you're selling, for lack of a better term, this vision, obviously you have to account for any potential pushback. Like in this case, if somebody says, "Oh, it's too flowery," oh, we're talking about gifts, but you're not saying that everybody has the same exact gift or same level of gift, but they all can make some sort of contribution, even if it's just something very small, like simply just sharing civic or educational resources, for example. But
Sure. Yeah.
one of the most current concerning issues of today is not just us distrusting each other as citizens, kind of like what we just sort of touched on now, but our distrust and antagonism toward political institutions, whether it's Congress or U.S. Supreme Court, and whether, regardless of how much government institutions have done it to themselves, there is this level of distrust that is just, it's just way too high. It's going way overboard. But a lot of times it's also based on our political views about who occupies these institutions as well. But for other people, it is a fundamental distrust, regardless of who runs these institutions. So, how does potentialism address and alleviate this problem?
Yeah. Look, this is not a recent thing. The decline in trust in American institutions has been going on for the last 50 years. And has a number of different factors. But what I would argue is probably the most important and salient factor is that people just don't feel like these institutions are working for them. They don't feel as though those institutions reflect their true concerns. They don't feel like there's any that they are effective kind of representatives of people's own beliefs and values. And so I think the first thing that I would say to this is to say, look, we have now found that the exhausted majority holds a variety of different views that they don't feel like are represented in the political system, in the political apparatus. And so no wonder they're disillusioned, because they don't feel as though their beliefs have a voice in this conversation. And then, of course, there's procedural problems too, right? There's gridlock, there's Congress not being effective, there's the filibuster, all of these sort of technical elements as well, which are obviously critical. What we're focusing on with potentialism is like, okay, can we at the very least start to develop a language that inspires and that offers a positive vision that feels fresher and different from what we have so far? And ultimately the aspiration is, look, can we build from this set of principles a political can we give political force to this set of principles in such a way that those types of principles ultimately get instantiated in positions of power in the government? And if those positions of power in the government do end up reflecting this particular set of principles, and if it is the case that people actually embrace these principles, maybe that could be the first step towards having people restore trust in the government, because they'll at least feel as though their views and their values are being reflected by the people who are representing them in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a sort of a more indirect way that potentialism could really help alleviate this distrust, I guess.
I think that's right. I think you got to look, you got to pick your lane, potentialism is a political philosophy.
Right.
It is not a technocratic solution uh to a particular problem. It is not sort of like ranked choice voting. Great. Love ranked choice voting. Love those people. Some of the other, all these other sort of proposals to how to make our government more representative, like fully support those. What potentialism is parallel to those, is trying to offer a new coherent framework, a philosophy that can allow us to make sense of some of the questions of what our rights and responsibilities are as members of a civic community in America at this point in time.
Right. And I think that really goes as a nice segue into the next question. We also talked about it a couple of questions ago with the practical versus the philosophical. And of course, you need both of those things when it comes to especially these ambitious initiatives, especially where American civics is concerned. So let's go a little bit more into the practical. What research backs up the potential of, well, potentialism, and how ready do you think the public is right now for potentialism?
So I mentioned some of this research about the kind of the rights and responsibilities portion of this. So that is a fundamental. We've seen that to be a fundamental schism in the American discourse. And so to the extent that potentialism is offering a more balanced approach to that kind of binary those binary concepts, I think that's one source of evidence that it could resonate. But even more to the point, the Beacon Project conducted a large survey of the American population last year, and we basically asked them, we were like, to what extent do you agree with this statement that our country should be based on a deal of rights and responsibilities? We have a right to develop ourselves, to have education, dignity, opportunity, but we also have a responsibility to use those opportunities in service of improving our own lives and the lives of the people around us and our neighbors and our country, to give back. How do you feel about that? How would you feel about that deal? Does that reflect the way that you think about this? And we got, so it was about 4 out of 5 Americans from all political points of view, left, right, and center, with almost no difference in levels of agreement across the political divide, are in favor of this. So there's evidence that even at a sort of at a conceptual level, there's support for this type of idea. Now, you might say, well, yes, but like, when the rubber meets the road, are people going to agree? And maybe this is kind of just like a pie in the sky abstract idea, but when it really gets down to it, you're going to, that number's going to drop. And then also you might say, well, what about that remaining 20%? Well, the remaining, so let me respond to both. I don't even know if you're thinking of those questions, but I'm going to answer them both.
Go right ahead.
So what about the 20%? Well, potentialism is not intended as a totalizing universal philosophy. It's not meant for everybody to agree with. It's meant to offer a home for people who have a particular set of views about this notion of that everyone has a gift and we have a right and responsibility to share it. So in that sense, it's in the sort of the positive sense of the word, it's meant to represent a faction in the American population that's advocating for a particular type of social change. And again, I mean faction in the sense of that, like, a flourishing democracy is comprised of people with different points of view that are jockeying and engaged in discourse and advocating for particular things in order to kind of enact that social change. Now, when it comes to, would you lose, would you have less agreement if you got more concrete? Certainly, I would expect that as well. The point is not like percent of Americans are potentialists, but it's more just to show that there is an inherent level to degree to which this set of ideas resonates, and it is nonpartisan. And so that is initial evidence that this kind of way of thinking could have some purchase on people's vision for the future.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I really appreciate you taking that time to that some of the things that people are going to say in response, because we do not just in this case, but in plenty of other situations where people say, "Oh, we support, you know, this constitutional interpretation of something, for example," but then when it's somebody that they tend to support, then they're a little bit more lax on how much they support the Constitution, that kind of thing. So that is a very good point to bring up. It is just about how you activate that feeling of people, that idea of how ready they are for the potentialism. But you said it, how not everybody's going to agree, and it's not meant to have everybody agree, this idea of potentialism, because you're never going to find any sort of statement that people are going to 100% agree on. If there is one, I'd love to hear what it is. You won't. The 20% is probably never going to agree. Maybe a few of them will break off and they'll see what potentialism does for everybody else, and maybe then they'll be convinced. But it is hard to convince those people. But it kind of also speaks to what you were talking about earlier. Not everybody. Lots of people don't really think ideologically. You hear all these appeals about conservative and liberal, and that's more for people, quote unquote elites who are in politics, and then the most ardently partisan and ideological voters. But most people don't really think in those ideological terms, and even sometimes when they do, they have different concepts of what those ideologies even mean. So it kind of goes back to what you were saying with that. And
Yeah.
so this is actually another great way to get into this next question, because you were just talking about these potential counter arguments, because it's always beneficial to be prepared for any sort of counter arguments to whatever it is that you're proposing, especially from
For
the most
sure.
polarized people in this case.
Yeah.
And so one particular one that I want to try to get your take on, various arguments you hear about depolarization in general, or that it's impractical, it's too flowery, touchy-feely, woo-woo, and so on. So what do you say to those potential accusations being levied against potentialism? I know you kind of already got into that already, but let's get into that a little bit more.
Yeah. I guess, do you mean like questions of it being like, because maybe I'll respond to your question this way. Democracy needs polarization. Democracy needs disagreement of people with different views. You don't want a democracy where everybody believes the same thing and holds the same commitments. What you want is a democracy where people can, in the using the words of Spencer Cox and Julia Minson, who are both doing phenomenal work in this space, Utah Governor Spencer Cox, Julia Minson is the Harvard professor. People need to be able to disagree better. That's the point. We need to be able to have disagreements, but do it in a way that's productive rather than leads to distrust and hate and lack of cooperation, conflict, that sort of thing. And so, that is the sort of the set of background conditions that are necessary in order for the kind of discourse that we want in our democracy to flourish. And that's essentially pluralism. Pluralism is the word that people use right now to describe the approach that what we want to be able to do, the approach that we want to be able to take in navigating our disagreements. Now, where does potentialism fall in this? Potentialism represents one viewpoint in this hopefully kind of uh, fractious and boisterous. I guess fractious is the wrong word. Let's call it a boisterous disagreement. Potentialism represents one view in this conversation of and a political identity representing an advocacy for a particular type of social change, namely a society that ensures and seeks to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to develop their gifts, and a culture in which people recognize that they have an obligation engage in that personal development, and also to help other people do the same, right? There's a kind of an emergent property of potentialism, where if I'm cultivating my gifts, it makes it easier for you to cultivate yours, and we all have a role to play in each other's lives and kind of identify, oh, you're really good at that. Oh yeah, you should do that more. That really helped, or whatever, blah blah blah. So what potentialism is advocating for is that type of culture of support and opportunity, and also a culture of responsibility. And so and that it is not intended to get rid of political disagreement, but it's intended to operate in a environment in which we have a more respectful and productive way of disagreeing with each other about these types of questions.
That is such an important point to bring up, as well as just the whole, you need some level of disagreement. I mean, it's going to happen anyways, but if it, like you said, if we're just agreeing on everything, you're not really actually thinking about anything. You're really just, there's no real critical thinking going on about specific policies or people running for office, and you need those things. It's just, of course, this is talking about trying to push back against the excessiveness of that disagreement, where it starts to become an existential crisis because somebody disagreed with us. But you do need that level of disagreement, and it would just be incredibly boring if we all thought it exactly the same thing about everything. Then there'd be so many unintended consequences of things that we miss because we just all said, "Oh yeah, this policy, it's got everything figured out," and nobody really thought about it from a different point of view. I think that's a perfectly fine, practical way to respond to those people who might feel that it's too abstract, I guess.
Yeah.
And as for the actual implementation of potentialism, excuse me, we must also go up against the various reasons people have for not wanting to engage with politics. Maybe they are open to potentialism, but they just, for whatever reason, don't want to get involved. And I want to go through several of the most common reasons that people have, just to see how you would use potentialism to convince these groups of people that they can and should engage in American civics. So, first up, how do you sell potentialism to these citizens who think they have nothing to offer, that they have incredibly low political efficacy, like we brought up earlier, whether it's they think they can't understand politics or that they can't make an impact? What do you say to people to try to those kinds of people, to get them to understand how potentialism can benefit them?
What do you say to your friend who says, "I have nothing to offer. I have nothing to. I'm not good for anything"? What do you say to that person? You say, "I disagree," and and ultimately, you are yourself going to have to see. You're going to have to come to that change of mindset yourself. No one can do that for you. No one can make you see your own worth. No one can force that on you. That has to come. You need to arrive and make that journey yourself. But what potentialism says is, we believe you have value, and we believe that if you were to come to arrive at that belief, that your life would be better and you will experience a greater sense of meaning and connection. And those things are available. And in fact, actually, part of what we're trying to do is to make those things more available by giving you the opportunity and making systemic changes to ensure that people have those opportunities. So, look, there's a huge amount of isolation and alienation and loneliness and anxiety in society right now. And there's no one easy fix for that. But part of the I think that the sort of what potentialism says is that we need to be making changes at two levels. We need to be making a change at the levels of systems. We need to be able to change institutions to be able to provide people more opportunities to connect, more resources, better education, more public transportation so people can get to public parks, that sort of thing, and connect with each other that way. So institutional change, but also cultural change. Cultural change meaning a change in the set of norms and values that we hold as a society about individual worth and the fact that everyone's contribution, everyone's individual role is everyone is playing a critical role, even in the sort of like the little corners of the country where they're not typically paid attention to. And so the cultural change is a change towards a deeper recognition of the important role that everybody plays in creating the society that we want.
It's kind of like that. What you said at the beginning is kind of like the phrase, "You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink."
Right.
You can give them all of the information about potentialism and about how it can benefit them, but ultimately they're going to have to be the ones to accept that. But I do think, though, that that potentialism has, not to make the pun again, but it has the potential to really convince these people that there is really something that they have to offer. It's a different way to really package that idea, where it's just, instead of just telling people you should go vote more, you should go learn more about politics. Like, they might understand, yeah, probably, but it's not really truly convincing them that they have something that they can contribute to our civic culture.
Civic life, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. And exactly right. I mean, there will always be people who resist that. And it's important for the theory and for the application of the theory that nobody is coerced into coming to a certain set of beliefs. As you said, leading to a horse, there's an invitation to adopt a particular worldview that I have value, I have something to offer, and that part of what it means to live a good life is to figure out what that is. But it is an invitation. It is not an assertion or a demand.
Yeah. And there is the one thing about trying to convince people think that they have nothing to offer, but there are some people who think that they have something to offer, or understand they have something to offer, but they're simply too afraid to engage with politics. So let's talk about this group. And it's understandable to be afraid to engage in politics, considering the uptick in violence that we've seen, assassinations and attempted assassinations, and just the increasing toxicity in political discussions. People don't want to get into arguments with strangers, family, friends. But how do you sell potentialism to the people who are just too afraid to engage with politics?
Well, I want to make a clarification here because I think it's important to note that engagement and contribution does not necessarily need to be about politics at all. It doesn't need to be a political act. If you're taking care of a dementia patient and working with them over the course of years, and their mental acuity is gone, they don't even know who you are half the time, that's a contribution. That's not political. It happens in a society, and to that extent we all are playing active roles in creating a society. But I would caution to use the word political to describe many of the gifts and ways of contributing that people have, because for the exact reason that you mentioned, which is that most people don't care about politics. Most Americans think about politics in the same way that I think about hockey. So they know that it's happening. They know that some people are excited about it, but that's basically as far as their understanding goes. And so I think it's really important to realize that for the vast majority of Americans, it's not about being politically engaged. It's about finding ways of adding value to your own life, to the lives of the people around you, including your neighbors and your friends and the people that you work with and the people at your gym and the people down the on the road and the people in the, in your town. So potentialism is not about necessarily about contributing politically. It's about finding ways of expanding your understanding of how you can show up for other people, period. But and if I don't mind, so that, I guess, I think will connect to to what you were saying about people being afraid. I think people are afraid because they don't see politics as something that's important in their lives, but that's okay. The fear is not like it's not about engaging in it's not about being politically active. It's just about being active, period, in your own life.
I think it's a shame that you couldn't care less about hockey. I enjoy hockey, but hey, different strokes for different folks. But something that you just pointed out there that I think is a very critical distinction. I believe it was my guest a couple weeks ago, Felicia Caleros, that mentioned this too, was there's a difference between being civically engaged and politically engaged. And like you said, if you say political engagement, a lot of people are just going to tune out for various reasons. In this case, talking about people who are afraid to engage with politics. But, you can frame it in a different way and say, this is not about politics. This is just about your community. This is about you caring about your community and being civically responsible to them and them being civically responsible to you. And I think that's a very important distinction to make for those people, because I think there's a lot less of a hesitation to be like, oh yeah, you know what, it's my community. I do have a responsibility to them, because I don't think they'll be as fearful of that. But the last group I wanted to of civically reluctant people I wanted to focus on, you actually just touched on them a bit. Some people think that engaging with politics is pointless, it's boring, it doesn't affect them. It's not about the fact that they think they don't have anything to contribute or that they're afraid. They just do not care, like you said. So how do you sell potentialism to those people? Or can you really sell potentialism to those people?
Yeah, I mean, I would say very similar to what I just said, which is it's not about politics. And so if you're afraid about being politically engaged, that's not what's going on here. What we're talking about is showing up for each other. And we're talking about enriching your own life by figuring out what it is that you can do to contribute, because you're going to experience a greater sense of meaning, you're going to experience a greater sense of connection when you figure out what that is and when you develop it and share it. So for the people who don't want to engage in politics, that's totally fine. We don't need to talk politics at all. We're talking about contributions. We're talking about showing up for ourselves. Talking about showing up for each other. We're not talking about politics.
I think that's a very reasonable way to address that concern. I think people will be more caring about their community as apart from politics, like you said. And I think there is a through line through each of those, I think, different groups of civically reluctant people. But of course, you can't treat them all the exact same way, but there is still a similar through line for them, is that there is that distinction of civics versus, or civic engagement versus political engagement. Now, obviously, we'd still like to have more people being politically engaged, but we can at least start a little bit smaller, get the civic engagement going first, and then we can start seeing more of the political engagement follow. So I always like to make sure to, and I know obviously we've had some actionable and practical stuff already, but I like to at least focus one specific question in guest episodes explicitly on actionable tips that viewers and listeners can take away and implement. So how can people get involved in the promotion of potentialism, of actually showcasing its values, and with the Beacon Project overall?
The best thing you can do is there's a very short little blog post on potentialism. It's a 5-minute read. I encourage anyone who's listening to this podcast, go check it out, read it, see how it sits with you. And if you know someone who you think might be interested in it, send it to them. That's basically all that we're trying to do right now. I would love for as many people to be aware of this. We're calling it a prototype. It's a prototype. It's not a finished product. This is not like, oh, we're rolling out the final thing and everyone needs to accept this thing whole hog. This is an experiment. This is a dialogue. This is a invitation to anyone who feels like they're maybe a member of the exhausted majority who wants something new, but who also holds hope for the future, to explore what it might look like to develop a new way of understanding what we owe each other as Americans and people right now, and how we can create the kind of society that we want. So the experiment is one that involves a lot of feedback and is very open and receptive to how people feel about this. And my invitation to your listeners would be, number one, Paul, if you want to include the link to the blog post on the in the resources that accompany this podcast, go check it out, leave a comment, and let me know how you think, and what you think about it, and then share it with whoever you think might be interested in it. That would be the best thing you could do.
Yeah, I actually am going to ask you at the end any links you want to share, so I'll be sure to include that as well. But I really appreciate the honesty about you talking about it as a prototype. Now, I'm somebody who very much struggles with I struggle with the trying to make things perfect instead of good and roll it out, because sometimes people just want to wait till something's a finished product. But you admit that, hey, this is just a first step. We're trying to get this ball rolling, and it also opens it to the public for potential suggestions from them too, how they can also refine, because ultimately potentialism is about the gift that they can contribute to our civic culture. And so it also makes sense that they can also help contribute to refining potentialism and making it a finished product like you were alluding to. So can definitely appreciate that. So we're just about running up on the end of this episode, but before I get to the final question, a random question, any final thoughts you'd like to share on potentialism, civic renewal, or depolarization, or civic culture in general?
Yeah, the thought I'd like to share is that I think a lot of people, anyone who's listening to this, is kind of there's a sense that we're really in a dark time in America. There's an enormous amount of concern about where we're headed as a country, how we're going to navigate our divisions, whether we're ever going to be able to get back to a place where we can see eye to eye and make progress on some of the most important issues that we're all facing, regardless of our political identity. And I really feel that. And I also feel as though moments like this are often some of the best opportunities to really go back to first principles, to ask ourselves what kind of a society and life we want to create for ourselves, and to really innovate and to create something better and different. And so what I would encourage the people who are feeling hopeless to imagine is, okay, what can we make out of this, and how can we build from here to a better future? So that's where I get hope from, which is like, okay, in this moment of concern and suffering, is there an opportunity for
I think that's a very great way to end this topic on potentialism. So definitely something for not just for those of you listening to mull over, but for me as well. So I really want to thank you for all of those insights that you brought, Daniel. We're going to go ahead and get to the final portion of this interview, the random question of the day. So for those of you who are listening who are new to the podcast, I like to ask random non-political questions of my guests just to get a different side of them. And sometimes these can be a little bit more, not depressing topics, but they can be a little bit more existential, can be a little bit tough to deal with. So sometimes add a little bit of levity to it. So for you, Daniel, today's random question of the day is, what is a hobby you'd like to develop, though you may not have the time or patience for?
Ooh, well, I'm going to say two. One is that I have been in a past life, I was a jazz pianist, and this was a
Okay.
major hobby of mine. And then for a little while, it was a little bit more than a hobby, but it is something that I have not really, it has sort of like been difficult to balance and get as much time at the piano as I would like with this new work that we're doing, as well as having a 3-year-old at home. So that is something that I would like to do more of. The other thing I would like to do more of is, I was speaking to a friend about running a triathlon, and I feel like it's the kind of thing that I would really enjoy. I would love to get really into some pretty major, like long-term feats of athletic prowess, although I'm far from that at this point. So that is an aspiration, maybe one for down the road. But yeah, those would be the two.
Nice. I am not musically talented. So maybe if I really worked at it, I could be something decent at it. Obviously, it would be cool to be able to play guitar or drums or anything like that. But one thing that would be really cool for me to develop, I have a whole bunch of other hobbies. outside of political science. So it'd be hard to devote time to this as well. But something that I would like to really get into is woodworking, because my grandpa, my
Mm,
mom's dad, he was a woodworker. He carved a lot. He also did some painting too, but woodworking was much more what I remember him doing. He had all sorts of figurines. There's actually have hanging up I think it's like a flintlock pistol that he carved hanging up in my room here. So he
wow.
carved a lot of cool stuff. But yeah, that's something that maybe at some point I actually will get involved in. And there is a little bit of that nostalgia, going up to Virginia to my grandparents' old house, and he had that shed that he'd work on woodworking in all the time, or he'd do it in the garage as well. So that would be something really cool to develop. But
Love that. That's
yeah,
great.
yeah, but maybe one day. But in any case,
Maybe one day.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
That's
in
really
any
cool.
yeah, but in any case, Daniel, thank you so much for your time and for all the insights that you provided here. So, real quick, any links that you want me to put in the show notes besides the blog post that you were talking about?
Yeah, you could put the potentialism link, and then you could link to the Beacon project, and that would probably. Oh, and then the other one that I would add is a link called civicprofile.us. It's a new website that the Beacon project just put out that is letting people explore how they think about what we owe each other as Americans and what it means to be civically engaged.
Nice. Okay. That's something that's new to me too. So I'll be sure to go check it out. So I will have all those links in the show notes. As for my links, my LinkedIn profile, which I write on frequently, my medium.com profile, which I write on from time to time, my Facebook page, Paul Rader, author and speaker, my 5-day educational email course about how we can all more effectively mitigate toxicity and polarization, and some of the key mistakes we make in that endeavor and how we fix those mistakes. My book that I wrote on Amazon.com, ebook and paperback format, my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com, and my website, paulrader.org. But that is going to wrap things up for today's episode. Thank you all so much for listening, and please like, comment, subscribe, and share on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else that you see these links on the internet. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.